Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Caffe Lena. Thank you. Thank you for joining us for another storytelling evening. For anybody unfamiliar with this monthly series, this is, it used to be an open mic where there would be one featured teller, and then the rest of the evening would be open for anybody in the community to come and sign up and take 10 minutes to share a story or a series of small stories. When we had to shut down and restrict live audiences for the pandemic, we transitioned to the format that you will see tonight, which is 3 featured storytellers, each taking a half an hour to share either sometimes one long-form story or sometimes several shorter stories. This format we are going to stick with for the time being, and at some point in the future, we will hopefully transition back to an open format. But for now, we have 3 featured storytellers. These are all regional storytellers that have served as the feature for some of our open mics, and they're some of the finest storytellers from the capital region and beyond. So tonight we're starting with Sandy Schuman, and then we have I believe Marni Gillard is second. No, Claire Nolan is second, and then Marni Gillard will be closing our evening tonight. So it's going to be a wonderful night. For those of you who are tuning in live through our live broadcast, we appreciate you being here as well. Everybody out there on the internet, that is the community that got us through the pandemic and to where we are today. So And these storytelling nights were never live streamed before the pandemic, so this is really a unique opportunity that we've had to share these nights with the wider community that may not have been able to make it to many of these storytelling nights in person. So thank you all for being here, wherever you happen to be. And if you would like to support the storytellers tonight, you can do that with our online tip jar. I will put the link in the chat. And on the screen, it's caffelena.org/tips. So if Sandy is ready, we'll get the stories going tonight. So please join me in welcoming Sandy Schuman back to the stage for our Caffe Lena storytelling.
Sometimes when we do storytelling shows, after the performance, we have a talk back, and people in the audience can ask questions of the storytellers. Well, I don't want to wait for that to happen. And I know the question, be quiet. I know the question that you all want to ask. You all want to say, Sandy, how did you learn to play the guitar? This is your turn now. Sandy, how did you learn to play the guitar? I like that question. And so I'm going to tell you how Christine Lavin learned how to play the guitar. Christine Lavin has been on this stage. She plays the guitar better than I do. And she tells this story. I liked the story so much that I asked her if I could retell it, and she said, sure, just make sure you remember the devil dog. So fairly early in her career, she appeared in San Francisco at the Great American Music Hall. And prior to the concert, the San Francisco Chronicle interviewed her. And the interviewer asked, how did you learn to play the guitar? And so she told this little story about how when she was 12 years old, she started listening to this weekly television program on educational TV, How to Play Folk Guitar. And the TV that her parents had was inferior. Reception was terrible. It had one of those rabbit ear antennas. And so she would have to bribe her little brother with a nickel, the cost of a devil dog, his favorite treat, and coincidentally mine. This is when devil dogs were wrapped in wax paper and they were fresh, no preservatives. Of course, I've never tasted one now to know that there's a difference. Anyway, with that bribe, he would hold the rabbit ear antenna out the window so that Christine got good reception for the full half hour of the guitar lesson. So she's told this story. It appears in the San Francisco Chronicle. And Laura Weber, who lived in San Francisco, reads this article and she decides she's going to go to this concert. And she's wondering if she is the one who taught Christine Lavin how to play the guitar. Well, Christine Lavin is about to walk out on stage, and the stage manager hands her a business card. And on the front of the business card, it says, Laura Weber Folk Guitar. And on the back of the business card, it says, did I teach you how to play? And according to Christine Lavin, this put the fear of God into her because she was about to perform in front of her guitar teacher, whom she had never met in person. So when intermission comes, she says, can I have the house lights, please? And she says, I've learned that my guitar instructor, my TV guitar instructor, whom I've never met in person, is in the audience tonight. Laura Weber, would you please stand up? And this petite gray-haired woman stands up and the crowd goes wild. Well, I can't say that I play the guitar as well as Christine Lavin, but I can tell you that we had the same guitar instructor. And when she died, sadly, Laura Weber specified in her will that all of those recordings, those weekly programs for, a few years worth of guitar instruction, that none of them be shown again. I think because she wanted to make room for a new generation of guitar instructors, and her lessons were so good they would sort of be in the way. So you can't look up Laura Weber folk guitar instruction on YouTube and find a complete collection of 3 years worth of weekly guitar lessons, so I'm going to summarize them for you now. Her technique for guitar instruction was terrific. She would teach you a little something to do with your left hand, and then a little something to do with your right, and then you'd learn a little song. So, for example, you learn to strum. You brush the backs of your fingernails across the strings, and then you use your thumb. And by gosh, you can alternate the bass with your thumb, and you learn a little song. Skip, skip, skip to Emmylou, skip, skip, skip to Emmylou, skip, skip, skip to Emmylou, skip to Emmylou, my darling. And then you'd practice that all week long, and I remember, I'm having trouble. It's hard. And in one of these programs, she says, that buzzing you're hearing, I'm trying to get a good buzz now to them. She said, you need to move your finger up closer to the fret and press down harder, and the buzz will go away. And I knew that she was talking to me. And it worked. And then there was plucking with your fingers rather than strumming, and then you could play all 3 fingers together. You could do the thumb and then just the first finger and the second and third fingers together. Every week there was a new thing. You could do all 3 fingers, the thumb and 3 fingers in rapid succession. And then let's not forget, you could hammer on. Now this was a little left-hand thing where you'd pluck the string with your right hand, and then using your left hand, you'd play the next note. And in reverse, pulling off. And then there was the slide. Well, week by week, technique by technique, song by song, here's a little bit of an overview. This is The Fisherman, written by Leo Kottke, who is a far better guitarist than I am, but what the heck. You didn't hear that? Thank you, Laura Weber. This is a 12-string guitar, and I know the question you want to ask. You want to say, Sandy, why do you play the 12-string guitar? Sandy, why do you play the 12-string guitar? That is a really good question. And it's a really good question because the 12-string guitar is harder to find. It's more expensive to buy. They break more easily. They're more costly to repair. They're a pain to tune and harder to play. So why would you play? What a question. You guys are so on. So I'll tell you why Leadbelly played the 12-string guitar. Leadbelly, that's Hughie William Ledbetter, better known to many as Leadbelly, the king of the 12-string guitar players of the world. And people would ask him frequently, Hughie, why do you play the 12-string guitar? And he would tell them this little story. He'd say, well, I was at a friend's house at a party, and I was playing the guitar, a 6-string guitar, and I was really performing well. People were singing and dancing, having a great time, and as I'm playing there, this gorgeous woman walks in the room. Don't you hate it when that happens? That's my Jews harbinger. So this gorgeous woman walks into the room, and he could tell that she was looking at him. And he wanted her to be looking at him. And so he's playing that guitar, that 6-string, and he has given it everything he's got, and one of the strings breaks. But he didn't let that stop him because he saw that he was the center of her attention, and he wanted to be the center of her attention. So he kept playing that guitar, and another string broke. And then another string, and another string, and that's why, he said, that's why I play the 12-string guitar. Well, there's another reason he might have chosen to play the 12-string guitar, and I will try to explain that reason in 4 notes. I will explain that the 12-string guitar is just like a 6-string guitar, except there's a pair of strings for every string. So the high E string, for example, instead of having just one of them, there's 2. And when you play it, you're hitting both together. The lower strings are also in pairs, but they're tuned an octave apart. Now, to compare the sound of a 6-string guitar to a 12-string guitar, and to do a fair comparison, because I could pick up that 6-string and compare it to this 12-string, but you might say that's an unfair comparison. They're different instruments. I'm going to play just one of the strings of the pair as I play these 4 notes. So here goes. Here it is again. And now I'm going to play the pair, 2 strings together. So it's got a bigger sound. It's bolder, it's brassier, and I think that's what attracts people to playing the 12-string in the lead belly style. Pete Seeger wrote a book on how to play the 12-string guitar in the lead belly style. Not everybody does that. They play a 12-string just the way you'd play a 6-string, and well, but altogether, that doesn't tell you why I play the 12-string guitar. Funny you should ask, Marni. When I was a high school age, one Sunday afternoon, I tuned in a radio program. I had never listened to this radio program before. It was called Folk Music of the World. And I tuned in the middle of the program, and it became apparent pretty quickly that this was the request show. And the host said, I've got a request here from one of our listeners to hear the full version of our theme song that we play at the beginning of every show, Living in the Country by Pete Seeger. Now, I had not heard the beginning of the show, so I didn't know what he was talking about. And then he proceeds to play not 1, but 2 recordings of this guitar instrumental played on the 12-string, written by Pete Seeger. And I was committed. I had to learn how to play the 12-string and play that piece of music, which I've been trying to do for the past 50 years. With, I would say, very limited success. The particular recording that I really liked, the announcer said, was from a 1959 live concert that Pete Seeger gave in London. He was blacklisted because of the House Un-American Activities Committee. And so he couldn't play in the United States. He was in Europe, and this particular concert was recorded. And I had been looking for the original recording for this thing for decades and couldn't find it. I've listened to, I think, every recording that Pete Seeger made of Living in the Country, which you might recognize if you heard it. It was the theme song for just about every folk music program in North America for a time. I couldn't find the recording until a couple of years ago. It was re-released in Britain. Apparently, it was never released in this country. So I got a copy, and I'm looking for, down the tracks, where's the recording of Living in the Country? Nothing. And then I see track number 4, I Knew Leadbelly. And as Pete Seeger introduces this instrumental, he says, my friend Leadbelly died just 6 months ago. 10 years ago. This is 1959. He died in 1949. His songs were never famous until after he died. His song, Goodnight Irene, was #1 on the hit parade in 1950. Of course, it was Pete Seeger and the Weavers that recorded it and made it famous. And Pete says, Leadbelly was not a fancy guitarist, but what he played was so powerful, it just had to make an impression. And then he proceeded to play this very Leadbelly-like, brassy, bold introduction, which then seamlessly flows into Living in the Country. But what that all made clear was that this song was written as a tribute to Leadbelly. And if you're familiar with Pete Seeger's music, he wrote songs that had lyrics. You sang them. And here's this one instrumental. I think it's the only instrumental that he wrote. But it turns out he didn't originally write it as an instrumental. I don't think there is any recording that has the words. And so even if you've heard the music, you will be hearing the words for the first time tonight. And to understand the words and how this fits in with a tribute to Leadbelly, we need to go over a little Goodnight Irene ground. And the way Leadbelly presented that song, he didn't just sing the verses. He might have done that on occasion in a performance. It was such an important song for him. He would sometimes come out on stage singing Goodnight Irene, and then when he finished the performance, he would leave the stage singing Goodnight Irene. If you for your homework, you can on YouTube search for Bristol Rovers Goodnight Irene, and there's a YouTube video showing the British Rover. This is the soccer team in the UK. The Bristol Rovers fans in the stands at stadiums all across Europe singing Goodnight Irene. They're actually kind of shout singing it. They're very energetic. And that's a whole story by itself. I'll save that for another time. But it's a good piece of homework. Anyway, as Leadbelly presented it, there was narrative, then song, narrative, song, narrative, song, and the narrative tied all those verses together to make a complete story. So just to focus on one verse that you need for this purpose, I'll give you the preceding context in a nutshell. The man who is singing this song wants to marry Irene. And Irene wants to marry him if her mother will let her, and her mother won't. So they're both disappointed, and the girl says, well, I will marry you. But before I go off with you and leave my mother, I want you to know that I've always lived in town. I'm a town girl, and I don't know where you live, so you better tell me. And he says, sometimes I live in the country, sometimes I live in the town, sometimes I have the great notion of jumping into the river and drown. Irene, good night. Irene, good night. Good night, Irene. Good night, Irene. I'll see you in my dreams. Well, we don't have time to do the whole song right now. I just want to point out the most famous line from that verse, which is, sometimes I have the great notion of jumping into the river and drown. Sometimes a great notion, the title of Ken Kesey's 1964 book, later made into a movie with the title, Sometimes a Great Notion. That phrase has gotten borrowed and reused by various artists over time. But the key phrase for tonight's purpose comes from that first line. Sometimes I live in the country. And that was the man's response to Irene, wanting to know where he lives. And I think what Pete did in writing this tribute to Leadbelly was he elaborated on that response. So I'm going to sing that for you and then just play it without the words so you can see how badly I can render living in the country on the guitar. And the question you want to ask now is, Sandy, why did you switch to the 6-string guitar, right? You all wanted to ask that question, right? Well, you might remember I said the 12-string is really a lot harder to play. And I can barely play this on the 6-string. So, I'm still working on it. I'm still practicing. Oh, I have to do a little retuning here. One other point, so you don't get scared. I can sing this song in one key and I can play it on the guitar in another key. So in order to do it together, I have to jump octaves every now and then. So just, sit tight and everybody will be okay. I'm living way out in the country. I rarely go into the town. It's always so lovely, delightful. I wish you would come around. Oh, won't you come away with me? We'd be so happy living in the country. Work all day, laugh and play. Work all day, laugh and play. Sing this song to you. Thank you, Pete Seeger. Thank you, Hudie Ledbetter. I'm still trying to learn how to play the 12-string guitar. And with that, I'm going to put my guitar down. And I'm going to introduce our next storyteller. Now, I have heard Claire Nolan's stories quite some bit, I would say, and I know that her stories have characters. Some of those Jew's harp solo on my phone. Some of those characters are characters from her family, and trust me, they are characters. Some of the characters are mythological, and Claire tells these sometimes complex, elaborate, mythological tales. I don't know what she's going to tell tonight, but I'm going to get out of the way so she can do it.
Thank you, Joe. Hello, everyone. What a beautiful audience. I wish the folks at home could see how beautiful this in-house audience is. And it smells so good in here. So next time you come, you have to order some of this delicious food that I'm watching pass me by as the waiters and waitresses go from table to table with all these delicacies. So thank you so much for coming and supporting Caffe Lena and supporting storytelling here in the Capital District. So the first story I want to tell is actually a literary story, and it comes from France, from Provence. I love to say that, Provence. Monsieur Seguin was a farmer. Well, perhaps that's too hardy a word to describe Monsieur Seguin. He was actually a gentleman farmer. He had inherited a beautiful plot of land from his aunt. It wasn't very large, just big enough for a small garden that he could grow food for himself and to share with some of his neighbors. He had some chickens, a few rabbits, a cat and a dog, of course. Who didn't? And Monsieur Seguin had goats, only one at a time. But he didn't have much luck with his goats, although he loved the goats best of all. The reason he didn't have much luck with the goats is because he would get a goat, and the goat would live with him, he thought, happily. And he thought they were friends. He thought the goat was pleased with her place on the farm, but it wasn't long before the goat would notice, not far away, the mountains, and smell the fresh breeze bringing the herbs and the grasses to the farm. And each one of Monsieur Seguin's goats left the farm and made her way up to the top of the mountain, where she was devoured by the big, bad wolf. Monsieur Seguin had given up on goats, or so he thought, when one day he saw a beautiful little white goat for sale by one of his neighbors. She was perfect. Her white fur curled at the ends so fetchingly. She had little striped horns. Her eyes, with those strange horizontal pupils, were green. She had a goatee that was the envy of any military man, I'm sure, and little hooves that were like patent leather, so perfect, so black and shiny. Oh, Monsieur Seguin had to have this goat. She was quite young. He was certain that if she came to live with him, she would get used to the farm and not want to run away. She would want to stay with him. He brought her home. He prepared a place in the stable yard for her. He made sure that the rope on the tether was long enough so that she had room to wander about the yard. He made sure that the leather on her harness around her neck was not too rough. He made sure that there were delicious things growing all the time for her to eat. She was content for a time. Each morning he would milk her, and she looked at him gratefully for this lovely little farm where she lived. Each evening he came back to milk her again, and she was still quite content. Days and weeks passed. It seemed that finally he had found a goat who would stay with him. But one day, as she waited for Monsieur Seguin to come and milk her, a breeze came off the mountain. What was that? And she looked up and saw. It seemed to her for the first time the beautiful mountain above her. Oh, what was that scent? She'd never smelled anything so luscious. If only she could go up there and find out what it was, perhaps eat some of it. Monsieur Seguin came and took one look at his little goat, and he knew. He knew what had happened. He could see it in her strange eyes. She wanted to leave him. She wanted to go off into the mountains. No, 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 please don't go, he said to her. You can't leave. Don't you know? Don't you know how dangerous it is up in the mountains? I've had several goats before you, and each one of them has gone off to the mountains only to be devoured by the big, bad wolf. She laughed. The goat won't eat me. I have my horns. I have my hooves. Your horns, your hooves. No, they will not protect you. Goats do not kill wolves. And he told her this story. The last goat that he had had was much bigger than his little Blanquette, this sweet little white goat. No, she was much bigger. She had gray fur, horns that stuck out so far, and hooves that were sturdy and strong. And Monsieur Seguin told Blanquette that this goat, La Renault was her name, had left him, had gone off to the mountain as the other goats had before her. And when she arrived in the mountains, she too was confronted by the big bad wolf. But this goat fought for her life. She fought valiantly all night long until finally, just as dawn came, she succumbed and she too was devoured. And Monsieur Seguin told Blanquette, if that goat, that strong, brave goat, was eaten, how much more quickly will you die if you leave me and go off into the mountains? Oh, Monsieur Seguin, please let me go. She hadn't paid any attention to a single word of his story. She just wanted to leave that little farm. She wanted to go off into the mountains. And Monsieur Seguin could see that she was serious and he was going to have to take action. And that evening, after he milked her, he put her in the stable and he locked the door with a lock, a combination lock, and only he knew that combination. And all the night long, she bleated and stamped and butted the door, but she could not get out. And then toward morning, she saw that she was not alone in the stable. The cat was in there with her. And somehow, that cat had gotten in, and somehow she was going to get out. She saw a little window. It wasn't very high. She was sure she could get up there. And she managed it. She maneuvered herself up and out the window. And she was gone in a flash. She was up that mountain before the sun rose. When she arrived there, at the top of the mountain, the fir trees, growing tall and straight, bowed down before her and touched her fur with their tips. They had never seen anything quite so beautiful as our little Blanquette. The grasses parted to let her through. She ate some of them. Oh, it was delicious, more delicious than she had ever imagined. She ate the grasses and the herbs. She ate so much, she became full, she became drunk. She lay down and her little legs were up in the air. Oh, she rolled around and around in the fresh, sweet grass. She rolled until she came to the edge of a cliff, and she jumped up and she looked down below her, and the morning mist was drying. And she could see down into the valley. She could see Monsieur Seguin's farm. She could see the house and the little chimney with the smoke. She could see that stable and the stable yard. She saw it all far, far, far below her. Had she ever lived down there? Had that little tiny farm ever contained her, who stood here now on top of the world? She could not imagine ever living there again. And all that day she ran through the mountain, uphill and down dale. She ran. It seemed like there were 100 little white goats on the mountain that day. And the other animals greeted her and welcomed her and loved her. It was a marvelous day. She went into the streams. She found a little waterfall. She dried off in the warm grass. She took a little nap. When she woke up, she saw that the day was waning. The air had freshened. It was getting a little darker. She had spent the entire day on the mountain, the most perfect day of her life. Oh! What was that? The big, bad wolf knew that another little goat had arrived in the mountain. And that wolf was going to eat that little goat. What was that? Down far below, it was Monsieur Seguin blowing his little bugle left over from his military days. It called, come home, my Blaquette, please come home. She heard the bugle. She had heard the wolf. She wanted to go home, where it was safe, back to Monsieur Seguin. Oh, but then she thought of the stable yard. She thought of that tether and the rope that was never long enough. She thought of that collar that chafed. Oh no, she could never go back there. The herbs there were bitter. After she had eaten the wild herbs of the mountain. No, she would stay there. She didn't care. She would fight that wolf, just as La Renaud had done. She didn't have to wait very long. She saw the wolf emerging from among the trunks of the fir trees, his eyes blazing, his sharp white teeth, his tongue lolling out of his mouth. Oh, look at her, that sweet little white goat. A little morsel for my evening snack. And he charged. But La Blanquette, she was ready for him, and she lowered her head, and she butted him so hard, he was shocked. He flew off several feet. What was this? A little goat to fight him? And the fight was on, and they fought all night long. Blanquette fought valiantly. She kicked, and she lowered her head again and again, and she went after him time and time again. She rebuffed him. Once in a while, she had a moment to taste some of that sweet grass again to get her breath. Every once in a while, she could run to the stream and get a little drink and think, oh, if only I can stay fighting long enough, if only I can live out the night, just as La Renaud had done before me, and then I will be happy. And again, she went after that wolf, and again, the wolf went after her, and soon her white fur, her perfect white fur, was matted and bloody. But she kept fighting. She did not stop. At last, the stars began to fade, and the wind changed, and she knew that morning was coming. She had fought all night long, and just as the sun rose, she bared her neck, and the wolf devoured her. Alphonse Daudet is the author of that tale, a very popular story in France to read to children. Well, Sandy mentioned that I have some brothers and sisters, and I'm hoping that some of them are watching through the magic of YouTube this evening. Oh, here's one right now. Hello. My sister. Hi, Patty. So, this story is about one of our brothers, my brother Ed. My brother Ed lives in the Bronx. My brother Ed is a psychiatric nurse, and he works on something called the Mobile Crisis Unit. So you can imagine what kind of a job my brother has. My brother Ed used to live in Seattle, and there he worked in a big hospital as a lab technician. Because my brother Ed likes to live in big cities. They're quiet and safe. But when my brother Ed is looking for excitement and danger, he likes to go to Idaho. And it was one time when he was visiting our sister Peggy in Idaho that this story takes place. Our sister Peggy has a much higher tolerance for danger and excitement because she actually lived in Idaho. And while Ed was visiting Peggy there, Peggy decided, along with some friends, that they would take a trip on a river. they were going to take a trip on the Salmon River. Now, the Salmon River runs very, very fast, and it cuts a gorge deeper than many on Earth, including the Grand Canyon. And it runs so fast that they call it the River of No Return. But Peggy and her friends planned to return that day because they had Ed to help them. So what could go wrong? Ed and Peggy and her friends woke up very early in the morning. They loaded the canoes on top of the truck. They climbed in and they drove to the place on the river where they were going to put in. And just as Ed was pushing Peggy's boat out into the swiftly moving current, Peggy called out to him, Ed, I forgot to tell you, the riverbank is filled with rattlesnakes. Stay off the rocks and avoid the tall grass. And before Ed could ask any more questions, that current had caught her boat and she was gone. Thoughtfully, Ed went back to the truck and he climbed in to drive to the place downriver where they were to meet. When he arrived at that place, he got out of the truck, he locked the cab, they were in Idaho after all, and he walked to the river. It was a beautiful summer morning. The sun was already fairly high and the mists were rising off the river. He was planning to spend a day hiking and taking some photographs and just enjoying the day. And he looked up the river and he looked down the river. And as far as the eye could see, Ed could see nothing but rocks and tall grass. And he decided that he was going to have to think like a rattlesnake. If I were a rattlesnake, he thought, where would I be on this beautiful summer morning? If I were a rattlesnake, he thought, I would be sunning myself on one of those warm rocks. So Ed headed off into the tall grass. And he walked along, and as he walked, he heard a scream overhead. And he looked up, and there was a red-tailed hawk. And it was circling above his head. It circled. Lower and lower it came. He could see its eyes. It was coming so close. He could see its wingspan 6 feet from tip to tip. He could see the sun glinting on its red tail feathers. And that hawk came closer and closer. It circled above his head. Oh, it was magnificent. He had never seen... Ah! What was that? Said Ed. And there on his leg was a rattlesnake. And he kicked it off, and it slithered off into the tall grass. The hawk had been hunting the snake. The snake had been hunting Ed. He was the bottom of that food chain. Well, Ed looked down at his leg, and he saw 2 drops of blood rolling down toward his ankle. And he knew that he was going to have to do something. So quickly, he reviewed everything that he ever had heard about rattlesnakes and rattlesnake bites. And he discovered that he knew exactly nothing. But then he remembered having heard or read or maybe seen on television or somewhere that if you cut into the snake bite and you suck out the venom, then perhaps, just perhaps, you will not die. So Ed reached into his pocket and he took out his knife and he flicked it open and he pressed it against his skin. I don't know if any of you have ever tried to cut into your own flesh, but Ed never had. But desperate times call for desperate measures, so he plunged that knife into his leg, and the blood flowed freely. And because my brother Ed is a lifelong practitioner of yoga, it was an easy thing for him to bend down and press his lips against the wound and suck out the venom and spit. Well, he hoped that had worked, but already his leg was starting to swell. And he knew that he should go for help, and he should go quickly. He remembered having seen a farmhouse not too far away, so he hurried to the truck, and he unlocked the cab, and he climbed in, and he drove to the farmhouse where the people were very kind and helpful, and they drove him to a hospital about 10 miles away. When they dropped him off, with the truck at the hospital. They left him there in the parking lot. It was quite hot by now, and Ed's leg was so swollen he couldn't even put his shoe on. He hobbled across the hot parking lot toward the hospital and emergency room entrance, and he went inside and into the emergency room waiting area. It was still quite early, and there was only a triage nurse and a receptionist in the room. And Ed told them what had happened, and he told them all about Peggy and the boats and the river and the tall grass and the rocks and the snake and the hawk, and he told them how he had cut into his flesh and how he had sucked on the venom and how he had spit. And the triage nurse listened, and she was unimpressed. She said that for that trick to work, Ed would have had to cut into his skin at least 1/4 of an inch. He had barely made a scratch. So Ed sat down to wait for the doctor to arrive. And the nurse and the receptionist were chatting, and one asked the other, "Who is on today here in the emergency room?" And the other woman said, "Dr. Duck." Dr. Duck, thought Ed. That's a strange name. And so he said out loud, "Dr. Duck, that's an odd name." And the receptionist said, "Quack, quack." And Ed started to sweat. He didn't have to wait very long before he heard someone out in the hallway. He heard someone walking with a cane, limping along, and that person arrived in the doorway of the emergency room, and Ed thought, "Oh, another patient here for Dr. Duck." But no, it was Dr. Duck himself, walking with a cane and his foot heavily bandaged with white gauze. In the examining room, while Dr. Duck was washing his hands, Ed said, "Hey, doctor, what happened to your foot?" Laughed the doctor. "You'll never guess. I was mowing the lawn, and I went over my foot and took off 3 toes in the process." Quack, quack. Indeed, thought Ed. Well, Dr. Duck examined him, and Ed told the whole story all over again. And Dr. Duck said, "Well, there's not much we can do about a rattlesnake bite except watch and wait. And perhaps tomorrow morning we'll operate." So they admitted Ed into the hospital. They took away his clothes and his shoes, and they gave him a hospital gown, and by now it was lunchtime, so they brought him a sandwich and some ancient magazines to read. And Ed sat there thinking about Peggy and her friends waiting for him, not knowing where he was or what happened. He thought about rattlesnakes and rattlesnake bites. He thought about Dr. Duck, who wanted to operate in the morning. And Ed decided that he was going to leave that hospital. He was going to go and find Peggy, and together they would decide what to do next. He asked for his clothes. At first they refused, but they couldn't keep him there against his will. So finally they brought his clothes and his shoes to him, and once again he hobbled across the parking lot and got into the truck, and he drove down the river to the place where he and Peggy were supposed to wait, where he was supposed to wait for Peggy. And he sat there waiting patiently until finally he saw the boats coming down the river toward him. And when she got close enough, Peggy called out, "Hey, Ed, what happened to your leg?" But she really didn't have to ask. She already knew. So once they got the boats all packed up, Peggy and Ed went to another hospital in another direction. And when they arrived at that hospital, they went into the examining room and waited. And while they were in the examining room, a nurse came in. And she said, "Ed, what's the telephone number for poison control in Seattle?" So without thinking too much about it, Ed just rattled off the number for her. But Peggy was surprised by the question. And she said to the woman, "Why did you think that my brother would know that telephone number?" And then that nurse turned and looked at Peggy, and Peggy saw her eyes for the first time. And Peggy says that her eyes were luminous and like cat's eyes. And she said, "Because I'm clairvoyant." And she left. And for years, Peggy has wondered why that woman's clairvoyance did not reveal to her out-of-state telephone numbers. Well, the doctor came and examined Ed and told him, just as Dr. Duck had said, that there really wasn't anything they could do for a rattlesnake bite, except watch and wait. So they sent Ed home with Peggy, and he spent a very uncomfortable 2 weeks as his legs swelled up like a pink balloon. But at last the swelling went down, and he was able to return home to Seattle, where things are quiet and safe. But when he returned home, he found a big stack of mail waiting for him. And on the top was an envelope, and it was a bill from Dr. Duck's hospital. So Ed took a pencil and wrote across the face of that envelope, "Return to sender. Patient died of snake bite." Thank you. So our next teller is my very dear friend, Marni Gillard. And Marni is, you will see, an extraordinary storyteller. I know you're going to enjoy her stories very much. She tells stories about her family. She tells beautiful folk and fairy tales. But more importantly, and you'll see this as she's telling, her generosity of spirit, her kindness will come through. Please, everyone, welcome my very dear friend, Marni Gillard.
Okay, lovely. You're all so bright under these bright lights, but I will watch for your eyes and your faces. Oh, I didn't bring my book and I want to. Hold on. I started out as a teacher, and I loved books of stories. And one day at a teacher conference, I was in Denver, and I went to the Tattered Cover bookstore and found this book. We're talking decades ago. And the picture of a woman holding a merman in her arms blew my mind. But what blew my mind even more was the name of the author, Jane Yolen. Jane Yolen had written so many books already that I had read, some picture books, some whole collections of different kinds of folk tales, and she's just loved the myths and the folk tales for years and years and years and years. And I've become her friend. She writes a poem a day now in her 80s. And I get to write back, and she writes back again, and we have these little, love notes to each other. But I'm bringing up the book because I have such a respect for her as a writer. And I'm a storyteller. She also is a storyteller, but she says, "Oh, Marni, go for it. Enter the story. Don't worry about my words. Give them the story. It's copyrighted. Please tell them it's copyrighted. No stealing." But I just so admire Jane Yolen and all she has done for storytellers and for me. This story is called The Fisherman's Wife. It is not the folktale that many people know. It is an original story. John Merton was a fisherman. He brought up eels and elvers and all kinds of creatures from the sea. And he would make pies from the meat in the fish, the different kinds of fish meat. And he would take things out from inside the fish. All kinds of things would be there, or their teeth, or all things, and he'd make little jewelry And he'd go to the markets and sell his wares. And he was a very, very confident fisherman. But if you asked him what he loved about the sea the most, he would say it's silence. He loved being out in the silence. And didn't he marry himself a silent wife? She was beautiful. Her fingers could do all kinds of talk, but she was mute and she was deaf. And neither he nor her father before her ever let her go to sea. But he loved her. He loved her, and yet at the same time as he loved her silence and her wonderful way that she could move her hands and her fingers and talk with him, and he'd learn how to listen. He'd learned his way with her way, but sometimes he just didn't want the silence. He wanted the loud talk of the market. And one time, he just kind of went off without even saying goodbye. And he went down the beach, and he was kind of, getting his own ears ready for all the talk, and he sang, buy my pies, just to sort of get that sound of the world that we all know at a market or, at a big place where lots of people are. And yet, all of a sudden, walking down that beach, he saw something that he had never seen before. And he wasn't even sure he wanted to go deal with what he was looking at. Now, he had seen many, many things on many shores, and he had caught many fish. He caught a shark once, and when he opened it up, there was a man's hand in the shark, and on it was a gold and tourmaline ring that was beautiful. Now, fishermen are often quite superstitious, and they think you don't be taking something from the sea without giving something back. But he took that ring and put it on his finger many years before, and he thought, that was something, and now it's mine. But this thing he was seeing, he wasn't sure he wanted to engage with, but it was a mermaid beached on the sand, and she was gasping for air. And he saw, and he knew from all that fishermen think about mermaids that no, she had no tongue. She just had a great hollow and she would not be able to speak. So he did feel a kind of compassion and a kind of allure. And he went over and he looked down at the details of her. There were parts of her that were quite lovely. And then there was that fishy tail with all those scales. And then they sort of went up parts of her body. And her hair, was more like rackweed, seaweed looking, not so pretty. But her eyes pulled at him. Her beautiful eyes with like little tiny minnows, it seemed like swimming around in them, and they were pulling at him. And he was mixed feeling, but he bent over and lifted her up in his arms. And sure enough, she wrapped that tail around him so tight. It was everything he could do to kind of unwind it and hold her at the same time. And he kind of hated to, and he kind of had to. He threw her back into the ocean, and her tail flipped, and he heard a kind of ululation that almost sounded like his name, John Martin. But he had to let go of that. Mermaids can't talk. They can't say words. And he just turned, and he went off to the market, and he sold his pies, and he sold his jewelry. and he drank up the profits. And then he knew he had to turn for home, and he did. And when he was walking home, he just tried to calm himself and think, yes, there's many strange things that the sea gives us, and the sea takes from us. And I'm just going to go home, and I'm not going to tell my wife about this. Now, Mayor Merton, his beautiful wife, who would sign her way, to his ears and his body in many ways, she knew instantly something was wrong. She could see it in his face, she could see it in his gestures, his posture, and he climbed right into bed. And he was freezing cold, it seemed. She had her great, beautiful quilt over him that was plenty warm, and she snuggled up next to him since he was, boom, ready to go to bed. Okay, I'm there too. But no, he was tossing and turning as if he were swimming and calling out. She didn't really know what he was calling out, but there was something about him being cold. She could feel like him shivering, and she wondered, what is this? Now, the next morning, he got out of bed as quick as he could, and he slammed the door, thinking, well, she won't hear that. But there are other ways of hearing. And she knew something was amiss. And sure enough, he went down to the beach and he got his boat. And he backed his way up, using the oars, and he looked at where, the beach was that he'd lived on all his life. And he just kept rowing himself out, about 1.5 miles, maybe. And then suddenly, there was the sea queen. There was the mermaid right over the bow. She had his wrist. She had her other hand on the oarlock. And he just knew there's no going back to my life. And he looked at her, and she was horrible and wonderful all at the same time. And he took his cap and he dropped it into the water. And then the two of them dove down, down, down into the sea. His boat eventually, filled with some water from waves and kind of drifted with the tide, and it ended up on the sand. And his friends found it, other fishermen. Now, they knew him well, and it wasn't a day for drowning, but there was his boat with nobody in it. And he was a husband gone to the sea. The fishermen would never say death and the ocean in the same sentence, but they took the boat to Mayor. The wife, this was what they would do. They would give the boat and say in their own odd way of gestures that your husband has gone to the sea. They didn't understand it. He was a good swimmer. He certainly wouldn't have drowned, but he wasn't there. He was gone. Now, Mare, she kept her own counsel in many ways. And despite her father and her husband never letting her go to sea for fear it would be too dangerous if she couldn't call out and all, she went down and got that boat, and she dragged it out, and she borrowed oars from others because the oars had, gone. And it wasn't easy to kind of get the rhythm. I don't know if you've ever been the first-time boater. It's not easy, and she struggled with it, but she memorized her piece of the beach. I'll be coming back here. I know I will. And she had also asked, when she got the oars, for a great long rope. And she got one. And there it was in the boat with her. When she got to a certain place, about 1.5 miles out, she saw his cap. There was her husband's cap. It was his marker. It was his word that this is where she should find him. She was sure. And she took that rope and she wrapped it around the oar lock. Not a ship, a fisherman's knot, but a love knot, but made it secure. And then the other end, she had to stand. She wrapped around her waist and tied that. It was a very long rope. But it was on her and it was on the boat. And it took some courage, but when she picked up his hat, she got to where she could pick up the hat. She knew this was what she must do. And she laid the hat in the boat, and she threw herself into the water. And she couldn't swim, but she could fall down, down. It was warm at first, and then much colder, and the color of the water was different as she went down. And she just trusted she could do this, and the ocean was giving her the chance. And she went down and saw little creatures and anemones and all kinds of fish, and finally her feet hit the ground, the bottom of the sea. And sure enough, there was a path. There was a palace. Beside the path, there were beautiful decorative coral things and statues made from bones and all kinds of things. And she thought, I'm going to do this. I'm going to get my husband back. And she walked in, and the mermaid was up on the dais. Oh, so the sea queen she was, with her tail that was sort of moving with the current, and her beautiful body, and her smile. She looked at Mare, and it was as if, oh, shall we be friends? And she knew the mermaid could not speak, just as she could not. But she tried to sign in a way, can you give me back my husband? And the mermaid kind of shrugged those beautiful, soft shoulders. Take whichever one you want. And as she moved her arm like that, Mare's attention went to 1,000 skeletons, all hanging on hooks on that part of the palace. Oh, which one is mine? How will I know? And again, the mermaid just smiled at her like, pick any one you want. Just gesturing the two. And she began to walk along and look at them, and some had little fish swimming in and out of the bones, and one had an anemone heart, sort of almost like beating inside the chest, and others. But where is my John? Where is he? How can I leave without him? And there it was, the gold and tourmaline ring. There it was, so clearly on that skeleton. And she went over and she tried to pull it off. She tried. She wanted to give something back, but she couldn't take the ring off. So she just untied the rope from her waist and looked at his bony body and that ring on his hand. And she turned and she worked his bones up onto her back like you might carry a child. And she found a way to get the rope to sort of keep him attached. And it almost seemed like he'd put his hands on her waist. And she loved that. And now she had to bring him home. And so she walked her way out of the palace. And then, she tried to, climb the rope. She never looked back, not for a second. But if she had, she might have seen the ocean returning her living husband. Why, it was giving sinew and skin and little veins and hair even on the skin and lines in his face. And she never saw any of that, but it was happening. And she just pulled and pulled until finally she sensed a way that he was helping. And there they were out in the air again. And she looked at him and he looked at her, and he helped her into the boat, and she was so tired. And he was happy to be alive. He rowed them back to the shore, and he took her into their home, and he put her in bed and just covered her a little. And he went over to the stove and he made some broth and he brought it to her, and he was wanting to put it to her lips, but her fingers began moving like, what has happened? What happened? And he just shook his head and he looked into her eyes with love and he opened his mouth. And she saw that he, like the mermaids, had no more tongue. And she took those hands of hers that could sign along his body or write a prayer or hug him or tell him what she needed to tell him, and she signed all along his arms and all up his back. The heart can speak what the mouth can't say. I'll be loving you always, just the same. Jane Yolen's The Fisherman's Wife. Oh, I love being inside that story. This is the world of storytelling where you climb in and you're in there, and it's a thrill. It's a thrill to tell, but it's also a thrill to feel your audience with you. So thank you. I have just about 7 minutes, but I am going to tell you a little version of a story. My dad was the diving coach of Fulton, New York. He had worked to get a pool built in that town. Oh, he had worked. And now it was a beautiful, beautiful pool with a shallow end and a high board, 3-meter board, and 2 1-meter boards. And he would line all the children in town who came. You just had to show up. You didn't have to pay or anything. You didn't have to sign up. You just showed up, and whoever was there, it was little ones like me. I was 4 3/4, waiting to turn 5. And we would walk the approach. 1, 2, 3, hurdle, spring up. And we did it over and over and over until we were thinking the Olympics. And diving is coming up in the Olympics. And it would be so fun to see it again, you know. And the big kids, they asked all kinds of questions. How do you do this and how do you do this? And my dad would go out on the board. He could do flips and twists and the dive where you kick your feet up in the air. It's like a reverse dive, and I could never imagine doing it, but I eventually learned how to do it. But this one summer, when I was almost 5, I'd made a promise that I am going to do a standing up dive off the high diving board. I am, by the time I turn 5 on August 24th. Not that far from now. And I had that promise, and I'd stand in line with all the big kids. You want to shiver? You'd stand in line. I got kindergartners to shiver with me one day, and I thought, this is a participatory story now. I love it. And I would finally get to go up on the board. But when I would do it, I would go out on the board, and I would sit down at the end, and I would rock. It was called the rocking horse dive. And I would rock back, and I would just fall off head first. So it was a dive. I wasn't jumping, but it didn't feel like a real dive. I had a big brother, Jimmy, who could do, a swan dive like a swan in the air. It was so beautiful. And sometimes he and my dad would do the low board and the high board, and they'd try to synchronize their dives. And my big brother, Danny, he could do those flips and twists and 1.5s and an inward dive where you dive toward the board. And you got to get your hips up or you'll hit your head. He has a few scars, my brother Danny. But anyway, it came near the end of the summer, and I hadn't done the stand-up dive yet. And it was evening. Dad, once in a while, nobody was there for lessons. He would take us to the pool at night. And there was about a 7 to 8 time that was getting dark but not closing the pool. And I said, Daddy, will you watch me? Tonight's the night. I'll do it. I know I can do it. Tonight's the night. Please watch me. And he goes, Marn, I got to teach Meggie to swim. She's not up to you yet. And she's got to learn kick, and how to get her arms going. And I was like, okay. He said, but go up, get in line, go up to the top. Call me when you're ready. I got up to the top. I sat in the thing. And everybody's going, let's go, come on. I'm like, I can't do it, Daddy, can't do it. And my brother Jimmy goes, hold the swan. I'm like, I don't want to hold the swan. I just want to dive standing up. But I finally got mad at myself, and I went out and swam back and forth in the shallow end, and I had a tantrum. Like, you know that feeling when you have a really good tantrum, and you feel better, and your brain kind of gives you stuff? I said, Marni, you just go up and you stand there and you rock. You can do it just gentle, rock a little, and then just dive. And I said, Daddy, watch me. I'm going to do it this time. I'm definitely going to do it. And he said, Marni, okay, I'm watching. And I got in line and I got up, and it was pretty dark. I could see the lifeguard wasn't ready to blow his whistle yet. He was talking to his girlfriend, which he shouldn't have been. And I just stood there, and I felt like I was smart now. I figured it out. I'll just dive. I'll just rock a little. Yeah, that feels good. Yeah, just rock a little bit. And then all of a sudden, something else in my brain went, you better dive hard because it's a long way. I don't know where that came from, but I think it was the devil. Anyway, I finally went, okay. And I dove as hard as I could, and my little 4 3/4-year-old legs came right up and kept on going, and I was flat on my back. I I could hear the angels coming for me. Oh, I'm dying. And then this big whale jumped in the water. It was hairy and everything. Hairy whale? When did we get a whale in our pool? And it was my dad. And he swam right over and he went, "You did it, baby. You did it. I knew you could do it." And I'm like, "I didn't do it right." He goes, "Oh, we never do things right the first time. Come on, come on." And he swam me to the edge, sat me on that cool, smooth cement. And I'm still crying. He goes, Marn, look at me. I'm bald. I hit my head on the board. I hit my head on the water so many times. People make mistakes. You got a life full of mistakes ahead of you, but you'll learn every time you make one. And my teacher says, "Don't give the story away to your dad, Marni. End it with yourself." My ending is my dad telling me, "Make all the mistakes you want." And I have followed that direction in many ways, but I've kept to storytelling. Thank you. Maybe my friends would come up and we'd take a final quick bow. Thank you out there in La La Land and here. Thank you. You've been a wonderful audience. Oh, we had song and bleating of goats, and it was grand. Thank you so much for coming to Caffe Lena, and thanks to all the wait staff and Reese, who's taking care of lots of things. And